Hey everyone, Realme has finally released their 7 series in the European market. It's more of a small upgrade from the 6 series rather than a full-blown overhaul, much like the T versions of OnePlus phones. But does this phone have enough features and upgrades for it to be worth it in such a packed mid-range market? I'm Angie for GSM Marina, and this is our review of the Realme 7 Pro. Our first impression of the 7 Pro is that it looks and feels nicer than the cold hard specs would have you assume. The frosted back is in a split mirror blue color and it looks and feels like glass. In reality, the phone has a plastic back and frame. While this is far from the most premium material, it doesn't feel cheap. Actually, thanks to the plastic, it's quite light for a device of its size and has surprisingly nice grip even without a case. The 7 Pro's size is actually a middle ground between compact and large handsets, so it'll be comfortable for most people. Turn the phone around and you'll find really slim bezels and a small hole punch in the top left. The Realme 6 Pro has a pill-shaped hole punch with an additional ultra-wide selfie camera, but I like that they're preserving more real estate on the 7 Pro. The front is protected by Gorilla Glass 3 Plus, and there's even water-repellent coating on the insides, which is good for a mid-ranger. You should keep in mind that there's no sealing around the phone though, so you should still keep it away from water. This is a shame, because maybe that would have made cleaning a tad easier, as the back loves fingerprint smudges. The 6.4-inch Super AMOLED has a 1080p resolution, and it's smaller than the one on the Realme 6 Pro. It doesn't have a high refresh rate either. Regardless, we're fans of AMOLED screens, and if we had to choose, we'd take an OLED over a high refresh rate LCD any day of the week. Quality-wise, we like this particular screen too. Color reproduction was good, though you'll want to slide the temperature slider towards warm for more accurate colors. Brightness was plenty for an OLED, and using adaptive brightness we got a max of 585 nits, and we got 460 nits in manual mode. Realme hasn't said that the phone supports HDR10, but the screen was recognized as HDR10 by YouTube. The phone also supports Widevine L1 DRM, so you'll be able to get maximum quality when streaming videos. Since it's an AMOLED, there's also an under-display fingerprint reader, and we found that it works pretty well. As far as audio is concerned, you can listen to your media any way you want. It supports Bluetooth 5.1 and it has a headphone jack. Also, unlike many mid-rangers, this phone has stereo speakers, using the earpiece as a second channel. The downward-facing speaker has more bass and is louder, but in general the sound was balanced between the two. Still, the phone could use more bass overall, and we found the output to be a bit shallow. On a positive note, the 7 Pro had very good loudness in our tests. Storage-wise, you're definitely covered. There is 128 GB of base storage, which is great, and there is an expandable tri-card microSD slot. The 7 Pro uses the same Snapdragon 720G chipset as the 6 Pro and 6 or 8 gigs of RAM. It handles day-to-day tasks fluidly, and most popular games as well. And surprisingly, it had similar performance to the 6 Pro and the Poco X3 NFC. Speaking of NFC, it's available in some markets like the EU, but not all. So if this is important to you, you should check the specs of your particular unit before you buy it. Where the 7 Pro pulled ahead of its predecessor is battery life. This, in part, is thanks to the slightly larger 4500 mAh battery and the OLED screen. In our tests, it got an excellent endurance rating of 113 hours. Where things get really crazy is the charging. The 7 Pro supports the new 65-watt Super Dart fast charging, and we got a 50% charge in 12 minutes and a full charge in 34. Honestly, it doesn't get much faster than that these days, let alone in this price range. The phone supports Android 10 and Realme UI 1.0. This new launcher looks much more like vanilla Android, with more minimalist-looking toggles and clean home screens. The navigation gestures are standard and easy to get used to, and you'll also find a dark mode that you can even force onto third-party apps if you want to. That said, even though it's snappy and clutter-free, you have tons of customization options. You can choose which icons you want, you can switch between different themes, and you even have the option of an app drawer, which is for all those that hate having everything on the home screen. There's also a smart sidebar like on Samsung phones, where you can keep some actions and app shortcuts. The Realme 7 Pro has a quad camera setup on the back. The main camera is a 64-megapixel quad Bayer one with an f1.8 aperture that outputs 16-megapixel photos. There's also an 8-megapixel ultra-wide snapper with an f2.3 aperture, a 2-megapixel macro cam, and a 2-megapixel depth sensor. The 6 Pro had a 2x telephoto camera, but we're not seeing one here, and honestly, that's a bit of a letdown. The main camera shoots pleasant 16-megapixel photos with spot-on colors and white balance, enough resolve detail, and wide dynamic range. We did notice occasional noise, but it doesn't get in the way. The camera struggles with some intricate details, but it produced natural-looking foliage. If you decide to take zoomed photos, the high-resolution sensor and the phone's algorithm produce shots with higher than expected quality. That said, it still doesn't compare to a proper telephoto. Portraits are also taken with the main cam, and they had proficient subject detection, convincing background blur, and excellent contrast. The ultra-wide captured photos with okay detail, accurate white balance, and again, natural colors. The shots were free of noise, but the dynamic range is average at best, even with the auto HDR. The macro cam is fun to use, but detail and colors weren't exactly impressive. In low light, photos from the main camera were okay, but nothing unexpected for the class. There's enough detail and pictures aren't blurry. The noise reduction also kept quite a bit of the detail intact. Colors are warmer than we'd like, contrast isn't great, and the exposure is dark. Switch to the night mode, and at the expense of some fine detail and cropped photos, you'll get much brighter shots. Highlights are restored, you get some extra detail in the shadows, and colors are much livelier. Basically, switch to this mode if the light gets low. The same goes for the ultra-wide camera. Regular photos are noisy, dark, and poor in detail. With night mode, images are brighter, there's more dynamic range, and quite a bit more detail. The colors and contrast are nicer too. Yeah, you'll have to stand still for about 3 to 4 seconds if you're using night mode, but it will be worth it. The main sensor can capture videos at up to 4K at 30 FPS, while the ultra-wide camera can capture up to 1080p at 30 FPS. Unfortunately, 4K footage was poor in detail and had limited dynamic range. Colors and white balance were accurate though. At least electronic image stabilization works in every mode except for 60 FPS, and it smoothed things out quite nicely. Full HD footage with the ultra-wide camera was average in detail but had better dynamic range and contrast. Colors are warmer than they should be though. The 32-megapixel quad-Bayer front snapper has an f2.5 lens with a fixed focus. Selfies have average detail, but in terms of contrast, colors, and dynamic range, they perform great. For some reason, regular shots are outputted in the full 32-megapixel resolution instead of 8-megapixel snaps. Selfie portraits, on the other hand, are outputted in the 8-megapixel resolution, and they have proficient separation, nice blur, and lively colors. The Realme 7 Pro is a very capable mid-ranger, and it has a great screen, design, battery life, and absolutely fantastic fast charging. Even the cameras and performance are good, although they're not as impressive. In short, it's competitive in the market as a whole, and its closest adversary seems to be the 6 Pro. Although it's more an alternative offering to the 6 Pro, and your choice depends on what features you value more. A telephoto camera and a screen with a high refresh rate, 6 Pro. An AMOLED screen with stereo speakers that can charge under 40 minutes, 7 Pro. The biggest threat to Realme's offerings is probably the Poco X3 NFC. But that phone isn't available in every market, and Realme is definitely counting on that. In any case, if you decide that the Realme 7 Pro has the right balance of features for your particular use case, I don't think that you'll be disappointed. Thanks for watching everyone, stay safe, and see you guys next time.